Good morning, everyone. My name is Greg Hall. I'm a partner at SEK. I've been with the firm for 32 years, and my clients I deal with are primarily nonprofits, and I deal with all sizes, small ones less than 10,000 revenue, up to 400 million in revenue. And within that segment, I deal a lot with affordable housing clients, developers, and also healthcare entities. So that's primarily my background here. Just a little bit of background here on this. What I'm going to do today, I'm going to go through what some of the best grant management practices are, and a little bit on the single audit here that you might run into if you're managing grants and what you'll have here. But I want to start off with a few of my favorite grants. It's not really my favorite grants, but I think many of you in here, many of you, my clients, are large organizations, but many years ago, you probably experienced these same types of items here, and you probably don't repeat these again, which I would hope. One is small grants with outsized reporting requirements. And I do receive calls, not frequently, but I do have them about every 3 years. It's usually a small nonprofit calls in and say, hey, we're just getting into grants and we've got this $5,000 grant and we need an audit, which tells me right there that all the money they got from the grant plus more is gone in the cost of an audit, which is usually followed by a conversation that should we do this next year, or I'm going to have to go back to the board. Maybe we don't want this grant. Because the fact of the matter is, a lot of cases, the small grant has as much reporting as the $1 million grant. So why spend your money with the small grant? And usually, not-for-profit starting out is because a grantor is saying, we want to see an auditor review before we give you the money. So they haven't really thought through the whole process and what's all involved in that. This is when I've run into an occasion grants where the staff have applied for it and management or accounting doesn't find out until they get a check for $10,000 and say, why are we getting this check from the county, such and such department? And then they find out that, lo and behold, somebody applied for a grant, they got it. It may be good, it may not be good. And we'll go with some points to help that. Grants budgeted with expense categories that have no resemblance to the budget or the organization's chart of accounts. And from an audit perspective, these are really fun to try and tie out expenses to because it usually it makes very little sense. Also, this is another one that sort of ties in with the second bullet where they get grants and it's not even related to the mission. That's usually when I'm coming in meeting with the CFO or controller and I say, why is this big liability? Well, we applied for this grant and realized we don't have the resources or it's totally outside our mission. So we're keeping it as a liability because we got to send the money back. So I've run into that before either. And the final one is not having the resources, getting so many grants that they end up sending money back because they haven't planned for the additional staffing and the additional costs that might be involved in this. So these are all things that I've run into. Hopefully these suggestions here will help you avoid that going forward. First thing is to treat the grant process as really a team effort. It should be an involvement between not only the program people who are on the front lines and see a need and might have the contact to do it, but also with the finance people as well and upper management. So everybody's on the same playing field. Everybody understands what's going on here. And if you do that, points 1, 2, and 5 would basically be addressed here. Also, identify the key activities and the desired outcomes. And by doing that, you might realize we don't have the resources, we don't have the right resources in place to do that and achieve the organization's mission. So that's all part of deciding, talking among things. Also, make sure all departments are comfortable with timelines and reporting that's due. One thing might be that maybe the reporting requirement is right during the end of the year when the accounting department is getting ready for the audit, or they're right in the middle of budgeting, and it might not be the best time for them to be involved in the process, or it might involve reporting that the program staff can't do, and that's got to be handed off, or the finance department can't do, and they got to hand it back for statistics to the program department to get that information. But that's all things that should be looked at here. And also, not only in the upfront part, just talking about the grant, throughout the whole grant life, those people should be talking amongst each other about what's going on. I mean, the accounting department doesn't want to get and say, where's this money? And somebody in the program department says, oh, by the way, that grant ended. But no one ever told them, and no one was thinking that it would go away, or it was the money was pulled and no one made the communication to let people know that it happened. A best practice here also be organized. And here's a real key point, and we talked about that in the one bullet point three. When you develop a budget, make sure the format matches your chart of accounts. So don't make up, I would not make up expense names or things that aren't there unless finance department knows and is going to add that to their chart of accounts. The other thing is at the beginning of the process, and I should say even during the process, it's best to have like sort of a data management system where all the data on that grant is kept. And I'll say that's the best practice because what I've seen in my career is where the finance person has all the finance reports in one data file, and the program person has all the program statistics in another data file. And if you want to know what's in each, you got to go to the two different people because they're all keeping their own files. It's best to have one centralized file with all the grant documents, financial reports, program reports, any statistics that's being gathered kept in that file. And whether you use a document management system, structure your server drive where that information is kept to accommodate that, whatever. But the better systems, I think, is one where I can go to somebody, maybe it's a personal preference, and they can say, I've got all the reports. Here's the program reports, here's the finance reports. We keep them all here in one place. And I think that also helps the people ministering the program that they're not running around to different drives or different locations trying to find information. Because there are times, I'm sure, that the program people need financial data and the financial people need the program data for different reportings. And also make a clear calendar of events. Decide up front what the key program dates are. Make sure the program people know, the finance people know when these key reporting dates are coming due, that everybody's on the same page. The realistic report here would actually cover bullets 4 and 5. And we'll start out here by talking about resources. One, do you have the resources to follow through on the grant that you're proposing on? And it might be that you might need additional staff. Well, if you're going to need additional staff, I think this is a great example in the current hiring environment is where are they coming from? How are we going to get as an organization, get these additional people if we get this $1 million grant? How are we going to administer? Do we have capacity with our own staff? If we don't, we're going to have to be hiring. And right now is a very difficult time, as everybody knows, to hiring. The other thing to keep in mind is if you're doing this program, the cost might not be just hiring for the program people. It might mean that now the administrative people, there's more administrative people need hiring. So the issue then is, well, if the finance people knows, they might say, well, that's great, but we're going to have to hire an additional admin person to help facilitate that grant or to help offload some of the current work we have. So there's two parts there to that, not just the program, but does the support staff have enough capacity to handle the additional reporting or whatever the additional transactions that might be involved with that as well. So keep that in mind. Some of the other costs that you might have here uh, might be government regulations. You take on a new grant, it might come with a lot of other regulations from the government that you might have to comply with. And those costs can sneak up on you very quickly before you anticipated them within the budget. And also be aware if you are going to take on a new grant, is that going to impact the ability to continue to serve the current people that you're doing your clientele to provide the services that you are and keep it at the same level that you want those services to be provided at? So are you going to rob Peter to pay Paul to give the new grant, to take on the new grant? I like the saying, my partner was involved in a mental health association for years, and his theory was there's a lot of people out there we could help. There's a lot of need, but we're going to focus on those we can. We're going to keep our mission there, and we're going to do the best job with the resources we have and only serve the amount that we can, the capacity we have. We're not going to try and serve everybody and every need. We're going to keep focused on what we can do and what we do best and recognize we're not going to be able to get to everybody, but what we do is going to be doing good. So I always look at that as a very good example as well. The next one is to treat the grant as a legal document, which means, as Krista had mentioned today, make sure you read the grant, because that has happened in audits. We come in and they're like, "Oh, we thought it said this and we were told this." But it's like, "Well, no, it's right in here in the slide. Oh, we never," then we follow by, "Oh, we never read that grant agreement. We thought we understood it, or it was a carryover, but we didn't realize they changed the requirements in it between last time we got it renewed and now." So make sure as a minimum that you're reading that. Also, if you have any questions, make sure you ask your auditors, legal counsel. I would also recommend that you contact the funding agencies as well and talk to them, the funders. And also be aware that some of the wording in these grants can be standard wording. I know a lot of the state grants that pass through, they have the standard wording about audits and non-discrimination and stuff. But just read those two and make sure you understand what they mean. It might mean some of that stuff doesn't apply to you, or you don't think it does. If that's the case, I always recommend talk to the funders first. Then you can call if they say, well, talk to your auditors, then call your auditors or legal counsel and follow up on that. Because the end result is you want to make your funders happy in the end with that. Another best practices really comes down to communication, and that encompasses all the bullet points that we had. It's incumbent that everybody's communicating throughout the grant management process here. I think it's important. The second bullet point, I think, is a very good takeaway. If you have grant changes, make sure you get it in writing from your funder. Because I've had situations in the past where they said, well, we had a person in that position as our contact person for 10 years, but they retired and a new person came in. And they always let us do this with the new person saying we can't. And it is in the agreement. The other person said, don't worry with it. So there you have a new person. And the fact of the matter is no one had it in writing. So if you have a change, make sure you get it in writing, either an email exchange or a letter, and keep it with the grant agreement in your file, because you never know. And that might become very important if somebody comes back to you related to that there. So there's some of the best practices there that are highlighted. This is going to be very high level here regarding the compliance and the single audit coverage here for the organization. And I want to start out the top talking about the first step for the single audit and compliance is if you're receiving federal state money, it really all starts with knowing what your revenue and expenses are from that program. That's like the very first thing that you would start with. And all transactions should have a proper period they're in and a proper account within your chart of accounts that you're putting them in. Now, the issue becomes how do you track those grants, particularly if you have multiple grants or if you have a main source of revenue and you have a grant on the side. I'm going to use QuickBooks as an example because I know a lot of the smaller nonprofits use those. There are class features that you can use set up within QuickBooks to account for each of those programs that allows you to break them out. I've seen people use chart of accounts. So for every grant, they have a chart of account number, and maybe the first two digits or last two digits are different for that. I've seen people use QuickBooks with one chart of account, but they make sure they code them to the right class in addition to the account to track this. But that's very important because that's going to drive perhaps what other external reporting you're going to need to do, whether it's a single audit or just a program audit here. Make sure you're able to generate the reports by the programs. And I would recommend that the reports you get are, if you're doing the program reports, by budget. As a practice, I like to see organizations I'm on, the grants by the budget, because really we know what the amount of money, have we got it all in, our expenses tracking there for those. And that budget process is a form of control. It's a high level control, but it is a form of control that board members can use to look at and say, yeah, within budgets, or why are we 10,000 over budget here? And it might be a very good answer, like, well, the grantor allowed us to overspend there because we're going to underspend someplace else. And you can see that's 10,000 under. But it's important that you have that in place, compare budget to actual, so you know where you are with that. Also, the complexity of your accounting system will grow with time as you have more and more grants. And the good starting point is determine if a compliance audit is needed. It is the starting point for this to determine if you need a compliance audit here based on this. Now, one of the first things is we get our program report and we look at it. One of the items to keep in mind is if you need a audit in accordance with uniform guidance what we call a single audit. And if you have federal expenditures, not revenue, because you may have collected all the revenue, but haven't expended anything yet. In that case, you wouldn't need an audit. But the minute you expend more than 750,000 of federal money, you would need to have an audit, and that includes federal money from all sources. So you could have 8 grants, each 100,000 of federal money, but once you tip that 750 total, then the single audit requirement would kick in as well. The 750,000 is important to know, and why the reporting by program is important, because if you have a program that has over 750,000 of federal expenditures, that's defined as a major program. The important thing to take away from that is there's special considerations given to that by the auditor in testing. Quite frankly, it's probably going to be one that's tested on a regular basis if you have more than $750,000. Now, I'm talking about federal here, but I just want to point out the state has requirements too. They may, if there's not a federal audit, the state may require you to have what's called a program audit, which is an audit, not single audit encompasses the whole entity. Program audit just looks at that program. So it may be there's other requirements from the state or maybe even the county government if you receive county funds as well for that. But it's important to look at the grant agreement and understand that. Third step here to determine is to not overlook the internal controls over compliance. Now, a lot of organizations are very good at having internal controls over financial controls or financial reporting, and that would also be key to this. But if you have certain requirements, such as if you have subrecipients, what are the internal controls to make sure they're submitting reports to you? What are your controls to do the monitoring? What are the controls in place if you have procurement information, certain size contracts? What is the control to make sure that's triggered, and who's monitoring that that's occurring? They may not have a bearing on what's on the financial reports, but they do for the compliance aspect. So don't lose sight of the internal controls over compliance that will be tested as well for the organization. And the fourth item here that we have is you've got to understand some of the compliance issues that you're going to run into if you get into federal awards and have major programs. I've listed some of the more common ones here, those being the period of performance. Keep in mind, these grants all have a period of time in which they run, which I'm sure everybody's here, pretty much everyone's aware of. But be aware there can be extensions. I've had grants now come out because they were laid at the state for 2 years. They're issued like a month before you got to spend the money. And some cases they'll give extension. There again, if they give an extension, make sure that you get something in writing saying that that's been extended and you have time to spend it. I've also seen, well, we know you only got 1 month, but you can go back 2 years and dig out your expenses and report them. That's always a fun one when you're given now, but you didn't plan on it 2 years ago. Now they're telling you to go back and get to claim your expenses and trying to dig those out. The other one, cash management here, has to do with one of the main things is not drawing the money too fast from the federal government. If you're a direct recipient and they give you an award, a lot of people may or may not realize you could theoretically pull all that money at one time. Now, they don't want you to do that. They'd like you to bring it in just as you need it to cover expenses. There are requirements that if you earn interest over, I think it's $100, you got to send that back to them or remit that back and reduce your award by that. But cash management, with how are you using it? Are you only drawing it when it's needed, and so forth? Activities allowed and allowable. Make sure the activities are that you're using the money on is what they're for. Some grants have matching requirements, and it may be that for financial statement purposes, the volunteer services doesn't meet the requirement to be reported, but for the matching requirement for some federal grants, that's fine. And the issue is how do you gauge or how do you value that volunteer service? It does not have to be volunteered for external reporting, but does for the federal government. And how are you collecting any of those match information, such as free rent, for utilities, what might you have? Also be aware of procurement of goods and services. And that would involve, as you engage vendors, making sure they're not debarred from participating in federal awards, having controls or compliance issues in place that at certain levels you need to get multiple quotes and then you need to get bids. Also, performance and monitoring, what oversight you have over the grant reporting. And the one area that when organizations get into having sub-recipients, or maybe they can't do all the work, so they have another not-for-profit do it. The thing to keep in mind is when you do that, they're still under your control as far as making sure you're getting reports from them, and that would include getting their audit reports if they have it. And be cognizant that if they have a finding in their program that you gave them money for, that's actually your finding too, because it flows up. So it's important to be monitoring your subrecipients, getting the reports and letting them know they have reporting back to you as well for the organization here. So I think some of the key things here that we have is just communication. Communication obviously is the key here for the organization. Keep accurate records and understand the grant program and the compliance requirements as well. This stuff should be pretty basic, but I think the first 5 areas, if you follow those areas, it should make your grant reporting and proposing much less stressful. Thank you.